Atsquel. My name is Catherine Woolwagon, and I am a grateful guest on the traditional unceded and ancestral territory of this Nanaimo people. I teach in the history department at VIU, and now I have a name tag that says I'm a board member. I don't even have to tell you anymore. I'm excited about the name tag. I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for tonight, Aimee Greenaway. Aimee is, as I think most of you probably already know, the curator at the Nanaimo Museum, also one of the managing editors of British Columbia History magazine. She is a sixth-generation Nanaimo resident, and she grew up in the former mining town of Extension. She's also an alumna of Vancouver Island University's history program, before my time, back in the Malaspina days. And tonight's Aimee's talk is entitled Fundraisers, Axe-Wielders, and Star Witnesses, Women on Both Sides of the Great Vancouver Coal Miners' Strike, 1912 to 1914. Please join me in welcoming Aimee.
That you can still hear after that incredible situation. Thank you to Catherine for such a nice introduction. And some of you know how excited I am for this moment that I am here to talk about women in the strike. As Catherine said, I'll be focusing on really highlighting stories of women and what their essential role was in the strike. And I hope that you'll see that as the presentation goes on. Their experiences were critical to the strike and to what was happening in the community. Often, the historical record doesn't include women's names. There's many communities who are not part of the historical record, and what has been really exciting for me is to go back and do research to find their names and learn about who they were. And I'm just so excited, more excited than most people should be, that I've found their names in a lot of cases and that we've got some information about who they are and what they were doing in the strike. And I think that you'll be, maybe not after the title that includes Axe-Wielders, but they really have some personalities happening. The strike took place in central Vancouver Island and quite a few communities, but I'm going to focus on Ladysmith and Extension because, as Catherine said, I'm from Extension. I'm completely biased, but Ladysmith and Extension women, their loved ones worked in the Extension mine, so that's a link between them, but I do have some great Nanaimo stories to throw in as well. There'll be time at the end for questions. I love questions. Please do save them until the end just to help me with timing. And an important question to start with, I think, is why are these stories important to me? So for too long, women were referred to by their husbands' last names. Mrs. Cowan, Mrs. Matthews, and it really separates us from who they were and what they were doing. And that's something that I've been working for a very long time to try and elevate their voices and bring their voices out. And I attribute a lot of this motivation to the strong women that I grew up with in Extension. I grew up there in the 80s and 90s. I went to school there. My grandpa went to school there. And this guy, my great-grandpa, he was an Extension coal miner, and he participated in the strike. And I think that that really shapes how I think about this story, because I was raised around other descendants of coal miners, and our families had known each other for generations. So the main setting, as I mentioned, is the Extension mine. And there's very little that's recognizable in this picture if you go to Extension today. Up until the mid-1890s, Extension was very much a coal mining community, or a farming community. In the mid-1890s, the Dunsmuir family were looking for a new mine because their Wellington mine in North Nanaimo was starting to peter out, and this was where they moved to. This is what the community looked like in 1900. To give you a sense of how many people lived there, the population in 1901 was 2,160. How do I know that, you didn't ask? Because I counted every one of them in the census. And I'm pretty sure that's around the peak of the population for reasons that I'll get into in a minute. The community was right up on the ridge right above the mine, but still right there. And there were hotels and schools, fraternal organizations, businesses like bakeries and stores, candy stores, and all of this served quite a diverse community. There were people from all over Canada who lived in Extension. People from the US came up here, including a community of about 60 black miners and their families. There are people from all over Europe, and also in Extension was Chinatown. This is the Tunnel Hotel, which I've included because in Extension, this is one of the most known businesses that existed. And hotels were really important in mining communities like this because, there was a bar on the first floor, and also the second floor was usually like rooming, kind of like a rooming house setup. So not like going to a nice hotel, but if you were a single coal miner, you could like live there. And it also has a link to a very cool Extension woman named Giuseppina Armanasco, who was Italian, and after her husband died, she owned and operated the Tunnel Hotel on her own in the 20s and 30s. She raised her kids in rooms upstairs, and some of her descendants still live in the community today. The mine operated until 1931, and around that time, of course, the population of the community dwindled, but there still was a very tight-knit, close community. Extension and Ladysmith, of course, are linked very closely by the Extension mine. When Wellington closed, a lot of miners, you follow the work, so they ended up in Extension. They established a community that you've seen in the photos, but then the owner of the mines, James Dunsmuir, this is like around 1903, he decided that because he owned Ladysmith, which is where the coal wharfs were, so a train went from Extension to Ladysmith, transporting coal, he thought that that would be a much better place for the miners to live at a place that he owned, which tied in really tightly with his management strategy, which was to exercise as much control as he could over his workforce. So this photo here shows miners in Ladysmith who just got back from work in Extension. Miners were told that if they didn't move to Ladysmith that they would be fired. So of course that pressured most people to go. But there were some who refused, and they did all sorts of things like walking partway down the train tracks so that they could get on the train in Extension and then get off with the rest of the miners at the mine. And it's, the two stories are so tightly connected that I wanted to make sure that we understood how that worked. The most devastating accident in the Extension mines was the October 1909 explosion. 32 men were killed, and like the toll of that on those two small communities, I'm sure you can imagine. This photo here is from the museum's collection, and it's hard to see because of the way it's aging, but if you come up to it with a magnifying glass, you can count 7 horse-drawn hearses. And so it really gives you a sense of the scale of the loss that people experienced, and this thread comes through in discussions that women were having during the strike. A couple of years after the explosion, the Dunsmuir family sold their interests in mines that they owned in Extension and in Cumberland, and the new company, Canadian Collieries, had a very similar management strategy. They did not support worker rights, so the experiences very much remained the same. But the real catalyst for the strike happened in the fall of 1912. A miner in Cumberland named Oscar Modishaw, he was fired because he was a union organizer for the United Mine Workers of America. The workers in Cumberland walked off the job in support, and the next day the miners in Extension did the same, and the bitter strike was on. This picture shows, to me when I look at it, what I see is the strike being something that involved the whole community. It wasn't just about the people on strike. The foreground shows a marching band in this parade through Ladysmith in 1913, and the parade was in support of the miners. Right behind the marching band are children and women, and to me that shows how critical their role was in keeping momentum happening in such a long strike. This is the Nanaimo Athletic Club, which used to be on Chapel Street downtown. And this is where the United Mine Workers of America Women's Auxiliary met. The mine workers had women's auxiliary branches pop up in communities in the strike zone, and this is where they met in Nanaimo, and they did things like organize parades. They had fundraisers like dances and concerts, and part of that was to help support families who were experiencing hardship, but part of it was that keeping people's spirits up and keeping everybody going. But there was much more happening than bake sales, as delightful as bake sales are. They were having weekly strategy meetings. They were figuring out where they were going to protest, where were the demonstrations going to take place. It was a very active organization. One of the other really interesting ways that women use the strike as a platform to share their experiences in the community and how the working conditions in the mine were affecting them and how the strike was affecting them was by giving interviews. And I found a treasure trove of interviews that none of the women are named, but we have their quotes. So it's good to hear their voices. So this is from February 1913, and it says, "Up there is the burying ground, watching and waiting, saying, 'Who's coming next?' And you never know who it's going to be. Maybe it's my boy she's waiting for. She got my husband." Another woman was interviewed at the same time, and she was nicknamed the suffragette by her enemies. And she said, "Who wouldn't fight if there were laws made for the safety of the miner and they were not enforced? How'd you like to go into the bowels of the earth if you wasn't sure at what minute an explosion might come? Of course they say the mines are safe." And so this is women explaining this is how it affects us personally, but also pushing back from the rhetoric that they're getting from the mining company and also to a certain extent from the provincial government. And the suffragette comment is really interesting because that same newspaper also has an article about how women in Extension want the vote. So this is before women have the vote because they're wanting to advance the causes of their husbands and their sons. It took a couple of more years before white women got the vote and decades before everyone had the vote. This one references the explosion in 1909. And this woman says, "You don't forget when you see 30 graves all new dug in a row, waiting to be filled with men you've known all your life. But wouldn't you fight and starve if need be, if when your man left the house, you didn't know how he was coming back? Way back in your mind, while you were tending and mending to keep your children tidy, you couldn't tell whether their father was coming back home on a shutter to die." And so this is a woman whose husband and son were on strike, and a shutter is basically like a stretcher. So there's also that element too, right, of what is the health care that's available to people who are injured at work. They're going home. And the Vancouver Sun again. No one asked, but why are there all the Vancouver Sun articles? Because the newspaper in Nanaimo wasn't very supportive of labor, and it's really hard to find this type of information in the free press. This is a political cartoon, and the person on the left with the top hat is Premier Richard McBride, and he is being told where to go by a woman who's saying, "You compel husband, brother, son to enter that," and she's pointing at a mine entrance, and there's a sign that says "unsafe mine" above it, and McBride's body language really speaks for how disinterested he is in mine safety. Parker Williams, who was the MPP in this area, which we now call MLA, so he was the provincial representative, he spoke and said some, I thought really just like nailed it. And he said, "This is a fight not primarily for a living, but for the right to live. This is a fight against the undertaker and the morgue and the Department of Mines more than against Canadian colliery." And this really backs up what it is that the women are saying. By the spring of 1913, Nanaimo had joined the strike in solidarity, and not everybody was happy about that. This little one sentence appeared in the Nanaimo Free Press that says 2 women were charged with raising a disturbance and were brought before Magistrate Simpson this morning and fined $20 and costs. Doesn't really seem very, like, what's happening here? Well, if you read the BC Federationist, which is a labor newspaper of the time, they go into great detail about how these women had gone to the mine in Nanaimo for the sole purpose of harassing strike-breaking miners. So they sang songs at them, they may have hurled some obscenities, and they were arrested basically for disorderly conduct. And so they went before the magistrate, and it's important to point out that the magistrate was also a real estate agent. I'll get into that in a moment. And the women's lawyers said, "You've never been to court before, you have no record. What you need to do is plead guilty, because you did it, and you need to express remorse, and then we're all just going to go home. Like, this isn't a big deal." Nope. Magistrate Simpson, according to the labor newspaper, was not happy about the stagnant housing market in Nanaimo due to the strike, and he threw the book at them. He told them that they had reached the lowest of the lows and that they should serve as an example for anyone else that was going to commit such acts. This is one of my favorite stories. There's a number of them, but this one's a beauty. So this is the Temperance Hotel, which still exists in Ladysmith today. And a formidable force in Ladysmith during the strike was Minnie Axelson. She, so excitingly, she used to be Mrs. Axelson. Now she's Minnie Axelson, and further research determined that she was born Mary McLaughlin, Minnie was her nickname, in Ontario, and her, she was married and then widowed. Then she married Charles Axelson, a miner who lived in Ladysmith but worked at the Extension mines. And her husband decided that he was going to do very much like the women in Nanaimo had done, which was follow the strikebreakers and harass them. He was going to sing strike songs, and this was all going to be spectacular. Except for he also got arrested. This theme keeps on happening. So he gets arrested. Meanwhile, Minnie is leading a ladies' auxiliary meeting about the strike. Someone comes in and tells her they've arrested Charles. She gets up out of the meeting, marches over to the jail. In the yard outside the jail is an axe that was used for chopping firewood, and she used the axe to cut through the door in the jail. And when she got inside, the newspaper reported that the law enforcement were awestruck when this woman, they called her the most ridiculous things. I think they called her a veritable Amazon in vigor and strength. They just didn't know what to do. So Minnie strode through, got Charles, and then all of them and their supporters led this triumphant march through Ladysmith to the Temperance Hotel, which was where the strikebreakers were being housed. Minnie Axelson with her axe, like the movie writes itself. So that happened the night before the riots. August 13th, 1913, the tensions of the strike erupted into rioting. This is a photo of the general store in Extension after it had been looted and ransacked. This is burnt and damaged mine equipment. So much equipment was damaged or destroyed. And basically what was happening is the tensions between strikebreakers and strikers had boiled over, and people are fighting. There are home invasions, houses are being burned down. It was not a good scene. This is the interior of Kwong Lee's store in Extension. Chinatown suffered extensive damage during the strike riots. And as I mentioned, houses were burned down too. So if you were a strikebreaker, your house was fair game. And I've got this image of the ruins of John Campbell's house mocked up in a slide because it ties in with a spectacular story that I used to hear when I was growing up, which is that at the community hall in Extension, they would have, in the 60s and 70s, they would have presentations like this, but slideshow, like click in the carousel slideshows, and they were focused on community history, except for when they showed strikebreakers' houses, because the photographer wrote the name of the house on it, they knew whose house it was. So next thing you know, the room is erupting. People are yelling and swearing. They're throwing things at the screen in what is supposed to be like this very nice community event. So what they ended up doing was reversing the slides to obscure the names. And I remember hearing that story thinking, like, I know some people whose ancestors could have done that, but like, is this too good of a story? No, it's not. So this is the same photo from the Ladysmith archives, and it's oriented the correct way. You can read, if you were closer, ruins of Mr. J. Campbell's house. This one is from a private collection in Extension that was used in the slideshow, and it has the name flipped. So that shows you decades later how deep that animosity ran from the strike. I'm never saddened to see the remains of mine manager Cunningham's house, the only house in Extension with 3 chimneys. He took to the bushes when the riot started. Some women and children were also in the bushes, but not all. Some of the strikebreakers also were hiding because there were people running around beating people up. There was talk of guns and that there was shooting. No one was killed, so that part was a bonus. When mine manager Cunningham came out of the bush, he hightailed it to Port Alberni. I'm not sure why Port Alberni, if he just thought it was so far away that no one would come look for him there, but that's a really spectacular part of the story. And this guy, William Bowser, so he's the Attorney General of BC, and he gets a report that there's rioting happening in Extension, in Ladysmith, I think also in Cumberland, and he had refused to mediate in the strike to try and end it or have any kind of support from government to help bring the strike to a close. But suddenly he had the resources to deploy 1,500 militia troops from the 72nd Militia, and they came into the strike zone. So there were soldiers all over Extension, and the miners hated Bowser so much that they nicknamed the militia after him, because they hated the soldiers as well, and they called them Bowser's 72, like Bowser's 72, because they were the 72nd Regiment. And when I was a kid, my grandpa would tell me about Bowser's 72 and how bad they were. And I remember saying to him, like, isn't it 72? Like, what is this twa business? And he was like, that's how they used to say it back in them days. And that was the end of that. Bowser committed all sorts of other heinous acts. If anybody would like to ask me about him in the Q&A, I could talk about him for quite a while. After all of this rioting happens, then the miners are rounded up and arrested. This is a photo in Ladysmith, and one of my favorite things about this picture is this group of women, this group of women, and this group of women. So as their husbands and fathers and sons are being marched to jail, they're marching along with them. They were furious because Bowser was so scared of them that he wouldn't let them into the jail. So he said, we can't have any women visiting, because if the women visit, they're going to collude, and there might be another riot, or there might be something else. And they were, to say they were mad was an understatement. And so what ended up happening is it increased conflicts in the strike communities. So the women were then like berating the soldiers, they were berating the strikebreakers that were still there, because none of the strikebreakers were arrested for their roles in the rioting. I think there ended up being a couple of hundred people being arrested. Minnie Axelson had another appearance in this story. Her husband, of course, was arrested for unlawful assembly during the riot. And when they had a group of like 60 prisoners and they were hearing evidence, and so they had women like Minnie in there testifying about what they saw in the riot. And the first thing the prosecutor asked Minnie is if she led the riot. And I mean, I don't know. I feel like she had it in her. But she said no under oath. And she said what she did do, though, was sing strikers' songs. And she specifically said she sang one called the Strikers' Rally. And the prosecutor, to his, I'm sure, internal embarrassment, he thought, oh, this will be really funny. I'm going to embarrass her by telling her she needs to sing this strike song. So he says, why don't you sing a few lines? And she says, all right. And apparently, Minnie sang like a bird. So Minnie's beautiful voice fills this courtroom with the strike rally. And so the strikers are the men who are prisoners. They're all pounding their feet on the floor. Women in the audience are standing on chairs and cheering. And Minnie's going through every verse. The judge is screaming for order. No one cares. And when she was finally done, there were so many rounds of applause that the law enforcement just sat there and waited for it all to come to an end. I know, Minnie really nailed it. She wasn't the only one who was testifying at these trials. The trials went on for months. Like, they started in September and went through February because there were so many people. This woman, Louisa Matthews, I'm excited about her because she just got a first name and a personality last week. She had been Mrs. Matthews for over 100 years. But Louisa Matilda Matthews was born in England. Her husband, Evan Matthews, was a miner. And during the strike riot, she hosted a tea party. When she was on the stand, the prosecutor was asking her, like, what did you see? What did you experience during the riot? Weren't you scared? There were people hiding in the bushes. And she was like, it was a little thing to me after the battles I've been through. And what had happened is her husband had served in the British military, and they were in northern China during what was called the Boxer Uprising. And I'm not sure what it was that she saw, but it was an anti-imperialist uprising, people who were not happy that the British were in control of the area. But she felt like that was what she saw in Extension was nothing compared to what was happening there. And when her tea party was over, she went out on the porch, which was about 150 yards from the mine, and she just sat there and watched. She described it as a battle where the strikers were fighting with the strike breakers. She described all the fires that were being lit, and she really wasn't that concerned. Jane Cowan's husband was a strike breaker. So she had a bit of a different experience. She would have been in her 40s at the time of the strike. She had an 8-year-old son, and they had a home invasion. What was happening is strikers were going into homes of strike breakers, and they were stealing things, they were damaging, they were lighting fires. And the prosecutor asked Jane if she had been assaulted while all of these people are ransacking her house. And she said, no. I told them I'd knock the eternal daylights out of them if they laid hands on me. And apparently she too was flourishing an axe while all of this happened. Another strikebreaker's wife was Lottie Maffeo, and some of you might recognize that name because her brother, Pete Maffeo, this little guy here, later became the mayor of Nanaimo and was a really prominent member of the community. Lottie, Pete, and their sister Annie lost both of their parents when they were very young, and they moved in with their maternal uncle and aunt, the Fontanas, in Extension. So Lottie had grown up in Extension. It was her community. In 1909, she married Gus Schivardi, and he was a miner. When the strike riots happened, they had 2 little kids. So Lottie was like 21 years old. She had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and people were coming to burn her house down. So her and the little kids and her aunt, Fontana, went and hid in the bushes. The next morning, the children were crying because they were hungry. So she took them to a farmer's house nearby and asked, like, please, do you have something that we can feed the kids? And he said yes, and let them stay at his farm for the next couple of days until they were escorted out by the militia, because it was believed to be the only safe way to get them out. And as I mentioned, they lost their house. Her aunt and uncle, someone lit their house on fire, but they put it out. Someone else put it out, not the people who started it. So it was like pretty serious, all these things that were happening. She testified in the proceedings as well, and she was referred to as a non-union Joan of Arc. She had given a gun to another strikebreaker, and that was in the media lauded as quite an important event. People thought that that was spectacular. But when you contrast that, Minnie Axelson was viewed very negatively. So you can see how there's the imbalance in the press. And what I love here with this picture is that you can see Lottie. It's the only picture that I've seen of the women who were participating in the strike, and I'd like to thank Carrie Parker for that, because her grandparents were friends with Lottie and her husband Gus, and so she had this photo. This is the courthouse in Nanaimo. And one of the things I found hilarious about the strike riots was that it was so unheard of for women to be committing crimes, especially on that scale. Like, there were so many women that it really came across that the legal system didn't know what to do with them. They were reluctant to charge all of these women. I doubt that they had appropriate facilities for all of the women. Like, there were lots of things going on. And so they said right after the riots, we're taking a list of women. Just because you're not in jail, don't think that you're getting off scot-free. And then they decided that they didn't want to manage that situation. And instead, they gave some of their husbands longer sentences. So, Charles Axelson, as one example, he was convicted of unlawful assembly, which came with a 1-year prison sentence at Ocala Prison Farm and a $100 fine, which was pretty significant. And those were the types of sentences that were being handed out. About 55 men ended up being sentenced to prison time. And this is what Extension looked like around the time of the strike. And what I think is the most unfortunate about this story is that they made it through the riots, people went to jail, they were coping with all of that. But then in the summer of 1914, everything just unraveled. The First World War started, which of course changed everything that was happening in society. And then the United Mine Workers pulled out their financial support, so there was no more strike pay. So by mid-August, the miners did a vote, and they decided that they were going to call off the strike and go back to work. Most of them ended up going to non-unionized workplaces, so they really didn't they didn't have the gains that they were hoping that they would get. Oh, look at this. This is a picture of the mine in the Coal Miners Park in Extension. So I recommend that you stop by and visit this place. It was established as a commemoration for the 1909 explosion. You can learn about the history of Extension. You can see it's at the site of the #1 mine. You can see industrial artifacts there. Or, if you prefer, you can learn about Extension from the comfort of your own home by visiting the new Heritage BC map. Extension is one of 70 places on the new Industrial Heritage map. So when I think back on this story, I am really struck by this like what women were doing and what they were accomplishing. And so I hope that that's something that you leave with, is like these great stories. These women were hilarious, they were resilient, they were trying to keep families together, they were really trying to accomplish a lot. But one of the things that I think is the most important to reflect on is how stories that have been buried or obscured in history, the information is out there in a lot of cases if you go looking. So if you spend the time, if you really dig through the research, there are incredible stories out there that are waiting for us to learn about them. And if you are a researcher or a super nerd, I've got my resources up here on the screen should anyone wish to go on a research quest. I do want to thank my coworker Daryl, who isn't here, but Daryl is a fantastic researcher and he is a great help on all of my projects. I'd also like to thank the Historical Society for inviting me and welcoming me here to share this story that I'm obviously very passionate about. And I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to be here and learning about local history. So thank you. Does anyone have any questions? Yes, Aaron. Yeah.
Move the mic down to whoever's talking. I'll take it.
You got it?
Have the other one? Yeah. Just a second. What's the other one?
Thank you, Aimee, so much. That was amazing. First question, do we have a picture of Minnie? Okay, we don't.
You'll be the first to know.
Okay, what an amazing story. My next question is, you noted that we don't have a lot of the names written down because women were identified by their husband's last name. So what's your role as curator to reclaim those names and to find the names, and how do we put that back in the historical record?
Thank you for that. Love this question. I think that it's important to really put your energy into that work and being committed to like going through line by line in the census, trying to think around the box. Like, okay, her name is Mrs. Axelson. Is there an Axelson in the census? Like, you really have to like cross-reference, and I think that when we put that time into it, for any story that's underrepresented, like it's incredible the stuff that starts coming out, and then it spirals because then you get emails from people who you know saying, hey, I've got a picture of this person you're researching. So they're out there, you just gotta pull them all together.
And do we have written record of that? Like, do we go back then and change records? Like, how are those captured?
Yeah, that's definitely, so like presentations like this, like making like the education, the public awareness piece, these are the great types of stories for in the museum. We cover this in BC History magazine as well. So I think it's kind of like adding to the historical record with our with the research that we do. And so many people do this type of work. It's a matter of getting it out there so that more of us know about it. Thank you. Thanks. Yes.
When I was in Ladysmith, I'm almost sure that somebody, some woman told me that one of the songs we used to sing was called Bowser 73.
Yes, it was indeed.
Do we have copies of that at all?
They do exist. There's even some recordings online. Some people have gone out and like sang the songs and tried to recreate them. So there are records of that. There's also a strike song called Nanaimo Jail, which doesn't speak highly of the conditions there. So there are strike songs out there and they are recorded.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Aimee, I know this is primarily about women, but could you say a little bit about Joseph Mears?
Yes. Joseph Mears was one of the miners who was sentenced to jail. He had some he was a pretty young man, but he had some pre-existing health issues. And you can imagine that the living conditions at Ocala Prison Farm were not great. And he ended up dying while he was in prison from poor health. And in Ladysmith, there is a beautiful monument to him in the cemetery. So this is the same cemetery that has like 30 burials from the 1909 explosion. And you can also go there and see, like commemorate Joseph. And I know that there's a few groups in Ladysmith that do an annual remembrance of him and as someone who died for the straight cause.
I just wondered why the union withdrew its support. Was it financial?
Yes, 100%, yeah. It was a long strike, and then there was all the uncertainty that was going on around with the start of the war, labor forces, and yeah.
Also comment that the mine workers were involved in the strike at Drummond, which was the major coal, or a major coal in Alberta.
Also in Colorado.
Yeah.
Colorado too. Yeah, lots of labor movements happening in that time.
Okay,
for sure.
can I have the mic? Do this. We'll have a chance to talk to Aimee at the end of the session and have a cup of tea and some comments. Anyway, I had a few things that occurred to me as we listened to your presentation, and one of it is just, it's wonderful to learn a little bit more about the background and the context of the mine strike in 1912, 13, 14. The other thing that kind of strikes me is that I'm a boomer. I'm a male boomer. And over my life, become more and more aware of the importance of women in society and so on. My mother and all the other kinds of things going around. So it's really nice to see that there are people who are beginning to study the woman's story. And that is something that there's a lot of it going around, but it's nice to see it coming down to the central Vancouver Island area, which it also occurs to me that central Vancouver Island was an area of a lot of kind of radical behavior.
Absolutely.
You know, not just in the labor movement, but there was women's suffrage and there was temperance. There were a number of other kinds of things around. And we often think about this, the women's role in that is the women are basically middle class and upper middle class. But here you're talking about the women who managed the families of the workers who were in the mines and so on, and how they took a role. And so that's kind of an important kind of shift in our perception of what's going on. So on behalf of the society, we'd like to give you an honorarium and a ticket. Now, you've got the check.
Yes, I have. I just gave it to you. I gave it to you.
We'll find a check in a minute. It's a car, all right. Anyway, please stick around and have a tea.